We began these Cultivate sessions by talking about the two greatest qualities of pioneer leadership, but that was only part one. And we are going to end Cultivate with looking at the two greatest qualities of pioneer leadership, part two. And I want to tell you about two men, and the first guy is an American, and it's going to take me time to list his kind of catalogue, his tale of disaster, but here we go. This man first tried his hand at business, but he failed after a year, and then he went into politics. It failed after a year, went back into business. That failed after a year. 3 failures in 3 years. It didn't end there. He asked his girlfriend to marry him, his girlfriend of 4 years, and she turned him down. Tragically, his second girlfriend died some time later on. All these pressures led to a nervous breakdown, and it was 2 years before he was over that. He tried his hand at politics again, attempted to be elected as Speaker of the House of Representatives. He failed. He went for another post 2 years later, failed again. After 3 more years, he ran for a seat in Congress. He lost. 5 years passed and he saw office again, and this time, you guessed it, he lost. At that point, he had found a woman who would be willing to marry him, but tragically, his son, his 4-year-old son, died at that point. That led to sort of 7 lost years. He came back, went for a post in the sort of Senate again, and he lost again. Amazingly, despite clearly being a loser, he was nominated by his party as a vice president in the general election of that year, but he and his running mate lost. Are you keeping up with this? 2 years later, he tried again for another Senate seat. Again, he lost. However, after another 2 years, in 1860, after 24 years of trying and failing at virtually everything he did, this man was elected President of the USA, and he's thought by many to be the greatest one. This man was Abraham Lincoln. Second man was born into a desperately poor family, had a really poor education. He was apprenticed as a shoemaker, and he failed it. He failed at making shoes. He tried his hand at running a school, but it functioned really badly. His marriage was a really unhappy one, during which time his daughter died early on. And he was a deeply committed believer, and he tried his hand at pastoring a small church, but his movement toward ordination from that failed because by all reports, his speaking and his sermons were so tedious and boring, they blocked his ordination. I know what you're thinking now. It doesn't stop them getting ordained nowadays, but it certainly did back then. And despite such a bad track record, this guy formed a missionary organization of one person, and that was him. Went to India, and he translated parts of the Bible into 29 different languages. One day he had a fire at his house, and in that fire, 10 years worth of translation material gone up in smoke, all gone, no backups. And as he sat there in the wreckage of his dreams, his goals and his long-held vision, the sweat and blood and tears of all his work, amongst all of that, he heard God say, start again. Start again. And he did start again. And this man's obedience and perseverance were used to impact the lives of millions of people. He's become to be known as the father of modern missions. This man was called William Carey. And these two men demonstrate a fundamental principle of pioneer leadership that I wanted to leave with you as we ended these sessions. Maybe you sort of began Cultivate wanting to know more practical stuff about planting, and we've gone through some of that. But you know what? The practical stuff is important. It's not vital. You won't sink or swim in your plant and planting journey on your practical failures or triumphs, or if you're a little bit unconventional. In fact, that's probably a good idea. But there is a reason that plants and startups and initiatives die, lots of them. And that's because of a deficit of two other qualities of pioneer leadership, the two greatest qualities of pioneer leadership, part two, and they are, I would say, courage and perseverance. And it's interesting to me that when God calls his people to a great task, when he confronts them with a journey that requires great leadership, is the first thing he urges on them nearly always is to have courage, to take up courage. Joshua, on the verge of entering the promised land, 7 times God says to him, have courage. Solomon, this young king on the verge of a transformation of a kingdom in this enormous building project, he tells him to have courage. Hezekiah, faced with the greatest threat to Israel's existence, take courage. Ezra, given the task of rebuilding the temple of God. Peter and John, in the face of Jewish persecution. Paul, in the face of persistent threats to his life on the greatest church planting journey of all of them confronted by God, and God tells them, have courage. He didn't ask them to have faith or patience or skill or wisdom, even though they would need those things, but he says to them, have courage. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Elijah, Daniel, Joseph, Mary, Peter, Paul, John, all of them confronted with a task that scared them to death at times. And God says to them, have courage. Have courage. And pioneer leadership in particular takes courage. If your experience is anything like mine, you will be told that what you're doing maybe is impossible. You will have the specter of failure hanging over you, probably. You will have opposition frequently. You will go through periods where all you want to do is pack up and retreat and do something safe, much more safer. You'll be tempted to retreat to a place of safety, of normality, of caution. And in the face of this, God says to you, be courageous. Take courage. Have courage. And last year, I read a book on Winston Churchill called His Finest Hour, which was talking about those years specifically between 1940 and 1945. And soon after that, I watched a film on Winston Churchill called The Darkest Hour. And if you've seen it, you'll know and find that as many quotes in there attributed to Winston Churchill, who was a leader characterized by remarkable courage. And in May 1940, he faced an overwhelming leadership challenge, a situation in which leading up to it, he had failed personally many times in his leadership. He was put into a situation where his country was faced with a deep and severe crisis. Most of the leaders, political leaders, saw little hope in resistance. He virtually stood alone on this. And it was in those dark and difficult times when he realized the essential characteristic of his leadership was going to have to be courage. And he was later to say these fabulous words that are quoted at the end of that film. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. And the bedfellow to courage in the arsenal of a leader is perseverance. Those of you who were of TV watching age in 1968, the veterans amongst you will know of a guy called John Akwiri. And this guy was a Tanzanian marathon runner, and he raced in the Mexico Olympic Games of 1968. And marathons are just crazy races at the best of times. But this was raced at altitude. It was a murderous race. It was really tough. And after this race had sort of finished, they all finished up in the stadium on their last lap. And after it was finished, the sort of stadium turned its focus to other events. And then several hours later, when the day's athletics were about to stop, suddenly this guy, John Akwiri, he enters the stadium on his last lap. And the crowd took a while to realize what this guy was doing. And then as he did his last lap and as he crossed the finishing line, the applause for him was absolutely thunderous. And in the press conference afterwards, somebody asked him the obvious question, you are so far behind, hours behind everyone else. Why didn't you just stop? And this guy, John Aquiri, answered them these remarkable words. He said, my country sent me here not to start a race, but to finish it. And I don't know anybody else from the Mexico Olympic Games of 1968, but I know an obscure African runner who came last in the marathon, and I know him because he came to finish a race. And if you read anything about planting, and most of it, the best of it, is written by Americans, of course. One of the greatest reasons for the failure of planting and plants of any description, apparently, is a lack of perseverance. And this happens largely because of something called the S-curve. And some of you might well have encountered the S-curve before. Business change consultants talk about this curve which measures performance against time. And this curve is as true for business and startups as it is for church plants and other Christian ventures. And I'm not a business consultant in any way, so I can't give you any detail on this curve. But what it says is that for every new startup, they see a dip in their performance initially. And this is because in a business anyway, you're putting a lot more investment in than you are seeing output. As in a business, a startup, you are trying to build up market share, you are investing in your advertising, you're trying to build up your product, and the output is less than your investment. And so it results in a dip, and these business change consultants say this dip often goes for something like 2 year span. And this 2 year span is absolutely crucial because it is in those 2 years when most businesses, most church plants and ventures actually give up. In fact, it is often reported that up to 8 out of 10, 80% of small businesses fail in their first 2 years. And these are reported stats on church planting, which again mainly comes from America, aren't much different. And why do these church plants fail? Those who study these things say sometimes it has to do with bad origins, wrong call or lack of discernment or unhealthy leadership. But they often say also it comes down to a lack of perseverance. When everything you do doesn't seem to be working, when your hopes and your dreams are crumbling around you, when all you'd rather do is go off and work in Tesco's, are you going to hold on? And in Hebrews 12, Paul talks about finishing a race. And as he neared his life's end, this image of a race became more and more important to him. And this desire to finish his race became more and more urgent. Something that he was so bothered about that he mentioned it in Hebrews, in Acts, in 1 Corinthians, in 2 Timothy. And it was something that he wanted us to know, and that is this. This thing you are called to, it looks like a race. And you aren't just called to start, you're called to keep running. You aren't just called to start, you are called to finish this race. And this call for perseverance is one that is faced by every single character in Scripture, even Jesus himself. Jesus himself had to set his face like flint and finish his race. And Paul tells us that it would be strange indeed if we did not have to follow a similar path. A few moments ago, I told you about a race in 1968 that I never saw because obviously it was before my time. But I did see another race. I was at my parents' house in 1992, and while I was there one afternoon, I flicked on the TV to watch the Barcelona Olympic Games that were happening then, and I saw a race run live in front of me, a race that I will never forget, and it went something like this.
To let it go. But if you never try, you'll never know just what you were. Lights will guide you home. Lights will guide you home and ignite your bones, and I will try to fix you.
And I don't recall who won the gold medal in the 400 meters in Barcelona in 1992. Not many people know that. But I remember a guy who, together with his father, who was that man who met him on the back straight, a guy who was there to finish a race. And in his interview after the race, Derek Redmond said that when his dad met him on the back straight of that lap, his dad put his arm around him and said, "You don't have anything to prove, Derek. You can stop now." And Derek said, he said back to his dad at that point, "Get me back in lane 5, Dad. I want to finish the race." And I don't know how your race is going at the moment. Some of you will feel like you are winning. You know, some of you will be flying down the back straight. Some of you, though, may well have broken down. Some of you may be on the verge of leaving this race. And it may not be you now, but it may be you one day. And if it is you, then I say to you, hold on. Hold on. Keep on holding on at the bottom of the S-curve when everything seems to be crumbling around you and it appears that nothing is working and your efforts are coming to a nothing. Perseverance is an act of will, and it is a gift of grace. It is one of the greatest qualities of pioneer leadership. I pray for you in this great task of Christian leadership that you and I have been called to. When times are tough and your resources are at their lowest, for the courage and perseverance to say to your Heavenly Father, get me back in lane 5, Dad. I want to finish the race.